Hello, guys. This is Thomas Byrd with Tabletop Life here to talk about my Ultramarines list for LVO. Before we get to the nitty gritty of the list, I want to talk a little bit about how we got to this list and the road to LVO, the lessons learned on some tournaments and builds, and the experience playing this list for the last couple of years, it seems like, and tweaks that we've made to kind of get it ready for this list. So, overall, my list design strategy is really geared towards practice, practice, practice. So I iterate and play. Even in 2021 with COVID and all the things that was going on, I easily got over 150 games of practice and tournament play. So I've got a lot of experience under my belt playing this list, and it all is formed in factions, and there's been many versions. I've tested lots of different builds. I've tested lots of different units, and I all try to squeeze them in to kind of build this take all comers list. I don't know that there is any such list that is the perfect take all comers, at least not so far that I've been able to build. There's always some version that is slightly better versus this versus that, and sometimes I pull the levers a little too hard, and I really leave it open weakness to a threat that I hadn't seen. And then with Gilman, you're just kind of from a design strategy, you're investing a lot of points into that character before you even put any HQs or anything else. So my Marines are just generally like to have buff characters. So my list with Gilman is very character heavy. I think even the points at 820 points, big portion of my list are just tied up in characters. So you better make sure those characters are doing work for you. I have to evaluate why they're even in the list. Some recent tournaments I went to. Two big ones in November, really kind of leading up for here today, January, week before LVO. That I played a lot into the latest version of the list. Warzone Atlanta in 2021. That was right before the big hit to Orcs and AdMech. So you could still take 6 flyers. You could still take the full freebooters shooting. All that stuff was still available in Warzone. The U.S. Open in Austin. That was the week right after that. So another big tournament. That one was the last hurrah of the old Black Templars. So the new Black Templars had just come out, but they didn't allow it for that. So that was the last hurrah of the old Black Templars. So let me talk a little bit about those two tournament experiences, kind of what I tweaked for that, or what I learned during those tournaments and how I changed the list for this. So in Warzone Atlanta, I was really gearing up for Orcs and AdMech. Those are the two opponents I thought I would face the most of. So my list was really kind of built on just tons and tons of shooting. So I had 10 Hellblasters, I had 6 Eradicators, kind of static on the tabletop, but lots of volume of fire, lots of heavy damage, lots of strength 8 and strength 7 that could just do a lot of wounds. So that was kind of the core of my list. Went to it. The first 2 rounds, War Master Challenge was a brutal affair. If you haven't been to Warzone, that was a new thing they ran this year. Very, very tough if you didn't take part of that. But first 2 opponents, AdMech. So here's the test. Did my list that was built to beat AdMech stand up? And it sure did. So I beat those 2 opponents pretty soundly, and I was like very, very pleased with how the list performed. The next 2 opponents were Grey Knights, and then I found some of the weaknesses that I had not quite planned for. Grey Knights is always one of those tough matchups. They are really got a good profile shooting-wise into Marines. They're very durable. They're very fast in movement. They got some easy secondaries, so they're a great army. And if they're piloted by a good general, even worse. So I play 2 very high-level Grey Knight players. Ended up playing Jack Harpster in one of those games. He ended up winning the whole thing with his Grey Knight. So tough game. I did not win that game. So what I learned in that was my Eradicators 24 inches, my Hellblasters, even though they can advance 24 inches, like I was limited in about where I could shoot, how far I could move, and if I didn't put guys in reserve, it was going to be tricky. And then the way that they could jump around, teleport, they kind of dictated where I went. And so if I couldn't mitigate their jumping around, I didn't have a lot of troops or units to kind of sit back and zone out the board. It just let them kind of use their longer range to move around. So that was a struggle. In the GW Austin event, I said, okay, let me take out some of these Hellblasters and put in some Scouts, some Landspeeder Storms. So I took out one unit Hellblasters, that's about 165 points, and I squeezed in about 180 points. I dropped some war gear to get one unit of Scouts and 2 units of Landspeeder Storms. That let me use Scouts if I needed a cheap unit for deploy, or if I needed to jump up into Rod, which is not a secondary I typically go for. Turn 1, I can just move up into their zone and Rod in their back zone, typically the hardest one for me to get to. Or if I needed to, just do some move screening, blocking, I had some kind of throwaway units that could move quickly in early turns to kind of jump out and do things. And I also had Landspeeder Storms that were super fast, so I could sit them in the backfield, not really needing them to do any work other than to zone out the board. That 2 speeders and 1 unit of infiltrators is a lot to, you can cover a lot of ground with just those 3 units blocking out boards. And then late game, if now I can now have the speed from the Landspeeder Storms to advance or move up to get into positions and not just be stuck in the backfield when I don't need to screen anymore past turn 3. So really put those in there to mitigate kind of the Thousand Suns Grey Knight matchups. Still kept the Eradicators because there was still going to be, Dark Eldar. There's still going to be Knights. There's still going to be some of the things. Those were the kind of the big baddies there. Tyranids was always a tough matchup if they have tons of Hive Guard, and that's when they had just gotten their new book to let them use all the stuff, was right around that time. And so kind of going in that, the results, I ended up losing 3 out of my 8 games. 2 of them were to Black Templars of all things. So again, the last hurrah of the old rules. I had kind of known on paper what it could do, but seeing it firsthand, I was not prepared for the Valve push and some of the strats that don't let you fall back. My army loves to just fall back and shoot. I can really kind of let you hit me, back up, survive, and still, destroy you afterwards. And then that was not the case. So that was really tricky. And then just being an OPSEC bubble, while I think I have the objective at the end of the phase, OPSEC move up onto the objective and steal it from you. That happened too many times for me to be happy about. So I lost that game. And then I lost to Manny Chima. I think he was playing the 3 Hive Guard, very over the top Hive Guard shooting, which was not great for me. So he went first, did a number on me, and then it was kind of over on turn 2 when he made some assaults into me with some Gene Stealers. So nothing really from a list standpoint that I felt that was really terrible. But what I thought I could do to mitigate it for the next round is put a couple different units in there to tank some hits. So we'll kind of go into that. So before we jump into the list, let's talk really quickly about, of all the years of playing Ultramarines, especially all of 9th edition, playing the same list over and over again, tweaking it just kind of marginally to, affect changes to account for all the latest updates for different armies. Here are the kind of core army strengths and army weaknesses that I kind of have to play to and against. So core strengths, if you are not familiar with Ultramarines or you're struggling with your Ultramarines, you got to leverage their hyper-efficient shooting in melee. So certainly I've built all melee lists, and I have had great success with them. It's very interesting. They can hit really hard if you really go all in. But it does take a kind of dedicated focus to melee. So typically you see Ultramarines doing shooting. You do have some fighting with Gilman and maybe some support units like Vitrix Guard, or if you do put in Blade Guard, maybe some aggressors. They can fight really well. But the key thing is, if you're using Gilman, which not all Ultramarines use Gilman, but if you're using Gilman, which I do, you got to leverage it. You're paying a lot of points for that guy, for all his rerolls. This army is basically the king of rerolls with Gilman. You're rerolling basically any kind of dice you want to if you set it up right. So you better use that. And so if you do, you get really hyper efficient shooting. You're surprisingly durable. So from an army perspective, Marines, they don't, if you're playing full castles, they don't die as quickly as some opponents expect. They're used to shooting Marines, and they know how Marines die. And if you can survive that, then you're already ahead of the game. I usually run with 5 Hellblasters, and people are always wondering how Hellblasters are alive at the end of the game. And there's a lot of ways that you do that, but one of the reasons is they're just surprisingly durable. And we'll talk a little bit about how I how they affect that on the tabletop. And then the last thing, Ultramarines are renowned for being the most flexible, I think, of all the Marine chapters. They're probably not the top chapter. If I had to guess right off the top of my head, I think Iron Hands is probably the top kind of basic Marines. If you're not talking about some of the other chapters like Space Wolves or Dark Angels, if you're just talking basic Marines, I think Iron Hands is probably the more competitive all the way build. There's some really strong, powerful combos in there. But from a flexibility standpoint, I think Ultramarines wins hand down. The ability to redeploy at the beginning, the ability to constantly just reroll ones or reroll hits for units just out and about with a strat, being able to fall back and charge, counting his stationary affects a lot of different weapons. Those are really good army strengths and makes it very flexible to kind of let you choose lots of different units. All right, so army weaknesses, especially around my specific build, it's really a castle build, so you're kind of like putting a lot of units all close together because you really want to manage those auras, right? So you're going to like take advantage of Gilman. You got to be standing next to Gilman, so that has a lot of pros and a lot of cons, right? You're really strong for people coming to attack you. You can go attack them, but you're kind of focused very centrally on this one location. So as you build and move across the board, you can't really afford to have characters in the wrong place because you need to leverage all of their auras. There's a lot of different auras going on. You have Feel No Pain, you got Invulnerable Save auras, you got Litany auras, you got Gilman auras. So you got to make sure all those characters, you got Bodyguard auras, you got all the things you got to kind of keep track of to make sure your army is protected at all times. You got low mobility, right? Because, you got to stay next to Gilman to get all the buffs, right? And so you're not really ranging across the board quickly without him. You're not sending units away from him. It's not like a chapter master where you like hit the button and then they get rerolls and they can run off. They'd only get it if they're next to him. So to get that full power, you need to kind of be sticking next to him. So my list particularly, it's all foot guys. There's no jump pack guys. You got the one bike chaplain. You got a couple speeders, but for the most part, everybody's walking 5 or 6. They're not moving very fast. So you got to figure out how to run the primary, run the secondaries on that low mobility. Next thing is low unit count. You really only got 1,200 points after all the characters to kind of play around with. So you don't have tons and tons of models. You don't have chaff units. You don't have bodies to just lay around the board and screen out. So that's one of the challenges you kind of work through. And this army's not built to trade, right? You don't want to give up units. You're not like sending a unit out there to die and then you're just going to repeat that for 5 turns. You can't afford that, right? So you really want to take, you don't want to trade, right? So how do you set that up? There's a lot of like nuance to the build. So when I talk to people about how my list works and how do you play it, on paper it doesn't look like much, and it probably isn't much if you're not used to moving all the guys. Like you can make one mistake and lose a lot of Marines and you could be done. So it's a little bit tricky to play. But when you do pull it off, it's a thing of beauty. All right, we talked a lot about all the general stuff. Well, let's go into what you're here for, looking at the list for Las Vegas Open 2022. I can't believe it's already 2022. Can't believe Las Vegas Open's already here. We're going to be in Vegas in a day or two. Oh, it's going to be great. Excited. So here's the list. I'll go over the whole list in broad strokes, and then I'll dive into some of the specific choices and why I made them in more detail afterwards. So we got the Supreme Command. Gilman is the Warlord. We got a patrol. We got Tigurius, a 10-man intercessor block with the assault bolters. We got a power fist. We got a Primaris Apothecary with the relic that lets him have a 6-inch Feel No Pain. He is not a chief apothecary. We'll get into that later. We got a Judiciar. He's got a warlord trait that's lets him heroic 6, so that's a big key. We got 1 unit of Hellblasters. Man, these guys do so much work. It's hard not to take 2. But 1 5-man Hellblaster squad. They got the assault Hellblasters, so they're rocking 3 shots each, strength 6. If you overcharge strength 7, I did spend to upgrade the sergeant to mastercrafted, so his is 2 damage base, and if he overcharges 3 damage, so that's really a tech choice that can do lots of sneaky things. I'm still running the 1 big block of Eradicators. They're fully upgraded to have all heavy meltas and multi-meltas. It's a tricky unit to use, but when they do get to attack, if they're attacking big things, they can drop the hammer. So it's really powerful. Everyone's always like, how much damage they do? They always ask. It's always funny. Vanguard, so a second detachment to go along with the patrol, is a Primaris Chaplain on a bike. Don't leave home without him. Every time I think about it, taking him out, I always get sad, but every time he rolls a 2 on his litany, I get real mad too. So we'll talk about that in a second. He's got the +1 to hit litany and the +1 to wound litany for shooting. He's got Rights of War, so he's OPSEC. That's a new change for me. And he's got Seal of Oath. So he's got my Ultramarine special relic that lets me reroll all hits and wounds against a single target. Very big for Ultramarines. Again, king of the rerolls, maximize shooting. Infiltrators is my go-to troop choice outside of the intercessors. This good unit that does a lot of work. We'll talk about how I use them in the army. They a big deal. People don't spend for a helix. I don't understand it. Some people go for incursors. I get it, but for me, infiltrators with a helix, money in the bank. This is a new choice for me. Blade Guard veterans. I put those in. We'll talk about why. Got 2 units of Vitreous Guard. These guys can't leave home without them. Bodyguards, great profile, stats. Everyone around here who's played me at any time at all, they learn to hate these guys with a passion because they're so good and they're so annoying. So they're a great unit on tabletop. And then the 2 choices I told you about that we kept from the new Austin event was the Landspeeder Storms. They did great things. They're fairly cheap. You can use them to block. You can use them to tank some smites. You can zone out the board, grab the center, speedy. Yeah, there's a lot of great things about Landspeeder Storms. Even though I hate to take them from without even having any scouts, but they do work and they're cheap. So, all right. So a couple of key choices and changes to this. Let's talk about the chaplain. He's one of the biggest changes. One of the things that I've struggled with the most is with Gilman being your warlord, you can only pay for 2 characters to have 2 additional warlord traits. And so like those are your premium things. Like how you build your army is based around those 2 warlord trait choices. And so typically in the early builds, it was like, hey, take the super chaplain. So he's got Wise Orator. So he's rolling his litanies on 2s. He can do his special. I can just drive off and cast a litany on 1 CP at a reduced cost. That guy was always the go-to. And then you had the Apothecary, who's just healing everybody with Selfless Healer for free. Like those were my 2 choices. Then once Dark Eldar came out and started destroying everybody and basically were my kryptonite, they could just charge from anywhere and they could turn off Overwatch. So all my tricks to like defeat Dark Eldar were out the window because I couldn't mitigate them from charging me. I didn't have a lot of bodies to screen. And, I couldn't shoot them before they came in because I couldn't Overwatch because they could just turn that off with strats and stuff. I was really in a bad way until I have to give a shout out to Connor Benatti. He showed this to me in a game, and it really opened the door for me to figure out and break the code on how to defeat Dark Eldar. It was the Judiciar. Well, the Judiciar by himself, easy to mitigate. It's easy to stay away from his 3-inch. I'd make you fight last. If you only have a 3-inch heroic, easy to fight units without him being able to fight. You have to force to put him up front, then he gets killed, and then he can only do that trick once, and then he's dead, right? But what Connor showed me was a warlord trait that I hadn't really paid attention to for a long time. It's an Ultramarine warlord trait called Warden of MCCrag. It lets you heroic 6. So the big thing with that on the Judiciar is what a lot of people don't realize for heroic intervention is the only thing you have to do is once you heroic intervene is move closer. You don't have to make it into a combat range. So you don't have to make it into engagement range. So if I have a big block of intercessors strung out in a kind of a semicircle and he's embedded in the middle, if you fight those intercessors, he can heroic 6 right to their back lines, not even touching you. He may not even get to fight you, but all he has to do is get within 3 inches of you, and I can make you fight last. So if you set it up right, you basically can't stay out of his fight range. And he's also great for just like sitting on an objective. You put him right on the center. Nobody can go sneak a small unit of OPSEC guys right near him. He can heroic intervene and go fight him. So very powerful. As soon as I discovered that, if you set it up right, you can defeat Dark Eldar charges in a good way. It's just so like that was the one thing that just all of a sudden turned the tide. My win percentage against Dark Eldar went through the roof. And pretty much when I see a Dark Eldar list, I don't even worry about it. That's one of my favorite matches. which surprises most Dark Eldar players because they see Marines. They think that's just an easy win for them. The other choice, so that's the Warlord trait. Once you take that Warlord trait, now that puts you in a bind. Do you want to have a Super Apothecary? Do you want to have a Super Chaplain? Where do you want to spend that other Warlord trait at? And so then for the longest time, I stuck with the primary Apothecary because I'm always healing guys back. And that left the Chaplain not rolling on 2s, instead rolling on 3s for his litany. And the number of times that sucker rolls a 2, it always makes me want to pull my hair out. Always makes me want to take the Chaplain out, quite honestly, because if he's not getting the litanies off, what is he there for? And I get so upset about it. But you kind of learn to temper your expectations, and you just got to play the numbers, right? If you really need it, you spend the CP, and if you don't, then you just roll your 66% chance or whatever. You roll a 3, you're good to go. And if you don't, you just like, well, that's just the way it goes sometimes. But after playing Austin and getting abused by Rights of War, I just really had to take a look at it and see, what can I do here? And now, Rights of War is not new. Most Marines players have Rights of War. I never take it, and I never thought I needed it. And for the most part, I rarely didn't. You didn't take objectives from me. Or you couldn't take objectives from me if you're dead. That was kind of always my thinking. And if you got near me, I would just camp up on the objective with my guys that can all heroic intervene. So if you got anywhere near the objective, I would just heroic into the objective and kill you, right? So, but seeing how the Black Templar player used the Rights of War against me, I was very impressed. So much so that it was just like, man, what can I do? And then, after talking with the guy afterwards, the players, we were talking about, well, why don't we try to put that in? And I was like, well, the Apothecary, this, that, and the other. And he's like, well, how many times are you healing? How often is it like critical that you do it? And so I started thinking about it, started looking at it, started watching. Sometimes you're just not using it but 2 or 3 times a game, and then could you get by with spending command points on it? You're like, well, I don't really want to, but I could. And what does that get me, right? So you start playing. So I played about 10 or 15 games with it, practice, and I started seeing the scenarios where it mattered. It mattered a lot. It mattered enough to win the game. And the Apothecary, like some games you're like, man, I really needed it. I wish I had it. And most games you're like, it'll be really nice. It's super annoying for my opponent, but it's not the end of the world, right? So, and what it also did is if you're not taking the Warlord trait on him, you don't necessarily have to upgrade him to Chief Apothecary. It's nice to heal 2 units, but if you're not healing him for flat 3, is it worth 35 points, right? Like, so 35 points is a lot in this list. So you're like, take that out, you drop him back to a basic guy, and now you got 35 more points. So that opened up a few more levers that you can maybe tweak around, play with units to see. All right, so went back through the numbers, tweaked it all around. I had 20 different builds. What I ended up coming back to is kind of the most balanced compromise I could come up with. I took out the scouts. That was a 70-point spend. I took that 35 points from the savings on the Apothecary, and I put it into that 70 to get a Blade Guard unit, right? So now I have a unit of Blade Guard. They don't really fit into the typical list, but here's why I did it. I had other options for, trying to fit in more guns, more Hellblasters. I could drop some Landspeeder Storms to do all that. I had lots of versions of that, but what I really saw was Landspeeder Storms did great against Grey Knights. Grey Knights are still alive and out there. We're not in the new world of different detachment stuff yet, so I got to deal with regular Grey Knights. Expect to see them. Blade Guard are great for blunting some attacks. So if you're going to charge me, castle me, charge into my castle, typically I have intercessors kind of as the front rank opponent. So you run in, you hit them, they're going to have a 5-up invulnerable save from Tigurius. They may be -1 to hit from Tigurius, but they're taking the hits. And so whatever hits and damage you do to them, that's, that's some OPSEC, which now I've kind of countered that with having Rights of War. I don't have to rely on that being my only OPSEC. And they're a big workhorse unit, right? They shoot a lot. So depending on the matchup, that could be one of my most MVP units. So they're not always the unit I want to put front and center to take the hits, but that's end up what they are because they have the most wounds, the most dice you can roll to kind of stay alive. Now you got some Blade Guards in there that you could potentially do that work instead. They got a better invulnerable save. They're cheaper to transhuman. They can counterattack, so that's good. And if you need to punch, they got a little bit better weapons. 2 damage weapons, strength 5, a decent amount of attacks with Gilman. Depending on what's attacking you, they can do some work. So that's kind of first thought. Put them in there. I don't necessarily need them for the main bulk of my own. And if I need to kind of sit a unit off on their own that potentially has to fend off some small threats, Blade Guard veterans can do that a lot better than just a 2-man Vitreous Guard, which is really my only other unit to kind of sit in the backfield. And I'd rather have those Vitreous Guard up in the front doing work, or bodyguard my 820 points of characters, right? So they need to kind of be moving forward. So that's kind of the thought there. The last thing is, I kept the Eradicators and I kept the Storms, right? So we talked about Storms, but the Eradicators, they're still, Thick City, the Talos. If it's a traditional, like I'm going to charge in with a Succubus, Judiciary handles that all day long. Some Incubi, no problem. If it's Talos, -1 damage, you need Eradicators. Like, that's the best Marine bet to take out those guys. Heavy hitting, plus damage, so you're always getting some counteraction on the D6 and the -1 damage. They can consistently kill those units. And they typically have enough range that they can run up and shoot. And still, get work done. They can't be outranged by Talos. So that's pretty good. And then, like, against some of the ad planes, AdMag and stuff, you're still good to go. Orcs, they're still good choices against Orcs. So the tricky part against Grey Knights is if you put some in reserve. Do you have the CP to manage that? Do you have the rerolls? Can you get them in range to actually shoot? So it's still tough. But if they come near you, and they come near your castle, you can do some work on them. So that's the list. I think it'll do well. I don't know that I can win LVO. I don't have hopes of dreams of this list being the killer crusher list. It doesn't work that way. It's a lot of finesse. It's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of margin for error. You got to be on top of your game at all times. Tyranids, Grey Knights, Custodes, I think are all like AdMech. Those are all the kind of the most taken lists this year at LVO. So you definitely have to kind of game plan for that. Another big change is I'm going from Warzone terrain to GW terrain. So now we're doing the frontline gaming kind of optimized player place terrain or whatever. So it's a little bit different terrain format. So I kind of have to tweak my list play accordingly. But I think this list has all the tools to do fairly well. I'm obviously going to go out there and do my best, represent Ultramarines everywhere. Hopefully you'll be cheering us along. Jaime will probably do a video as well on his Space Wolves. I think he's the #1 Space Wolf player, so we're very proud of him. He's going out there to do work with his Space Wolves. Did a lot of work over the holiday break to kind of spruce up his painting and add some new stuff to his display base and his basing. So his guys are really looking great on a tabletop. So hopefully we'll have some great coverage of his battles out there and his lists, and you'll see some updates on his army before we go. If you like what you've seen or you want to see more, definitely hit that like and subscribe button. There's tons and tons of Space Wolf and Ultramarine content for all you fans out there. Me going on and on about Ultramarines I love so much. And certainly we're going to be playing some games at LVO, having a great time. We'll send out some updates as well. Hope you can join us. Check it out. And then until next time, and if you're at LVO, come out and say hi. Say hi and meet us. We'd love to meet you and say hello, talk shop. But until then, till the next one, we'll see you. Take care.